On the morning of January 30th, 2002, a little after 11 o'clock, a 58-year-old tourist from the United Kingdom waded into shallow water at a beach on Hamilton Island in the Whitsundays, off the coast of Queensland, Australia. The water was warm and clear. He had been in it for only a few moments when he felt something touch his face and chest. There was a mild sting, the kind of thing a swimmer might rub at and ignore. He came out of the water, and then, over the next 20 minutes, according to the case report later published in the Medical Journal of Australia, his body began to fail in a way that made no sense for a man who appeared, on his skin, to be almost unmarked. Severe cramping pain spread through his muscles. He began sweating heavily. He became anxious, then nauseated, then distressed in a way the people around him couldn't explain and couldn't stop. His blood pressure climbed to catastrophic levels. Inside his skull, a vessel gave way. He died in hospital of a bleed in the brain, and the physicians who documented the case recorded something remarkable in the driest possible language. This was the first death ever attributed to a condition called Irukandji syndrome. Here's the detail that keeps this case open. More than 2 decades later, the animal that killed him was never found. It was never seen. Not by him, not by the swimmers around him, not by anyone who searched the water afterward. Based on the syndrome, on decades of stings along that coast, and on what turned up in research nets in the years that followed, the medical literature points to a jellyfish roughly the size of a fingernail, transparent in the water, trailing threads thinner than fishing line. The sting mark it leaves is often so faint that emergency doctors have learned to diagnose it by the symptoms alone, because the skin frequently shows almost nothing. A man walked into knee-deep water on a resort island in daylight, a few steps from shore, and was killed by an animal that no one present ever laid eyes on. Keep that file within reach. It belongs to one continent's chapter in this story, and we'll come back to it, because it turns out to be the purest example of a rule that took scientists a long time to say out loud. Over the next 2 hours, this is going to work like a case review. 7 continents, one at a time. Australia and Oceania, Asia, Africa, North America, South America, Europe, and at the end, Antarctica, which is the strangest file in the whole drawer. For each coastline, the question's the one in the title. Which sea creature is actually the most dangerous one there? And that word, dangerous, is where honesty has to start, because it's one of the most abused words in the entire natural history genre. There are 2 completely different ways to answer it. The first way ranks animals by weaponry. Venom potency measured in laboratory animals, bite force measured in pounds per square inch, size, speed, armament. By that measure, the ocean's full of monsters, and the rankings write themselves. The second way ranks animals by the record. Documented human deaths, documented injuries, hospital admissions, coroner's files, official databases, medical journals, the actual paper trail of what has happened to real people in real water. By that measure, the rankings look very different. And some of the most heavily armed animals in the sea drop toward the bottom of the list, while creatures most people have never worried about climb toward the top. This documentary uses the second measure. Every animal named in the next 2 hours earns its place through documented cases and honest statistics, with the uncertainty stated plainly where the records are thin. Where a number is an estimate, it'll be called an estimate. Where a famous story doesn't survive contact with the evidence, that gets said too, because a few of the most repeated sea monster stories on the internet are going to come apart under examination before this is over. And there's a thesis, and it may as well be stated up front, because every continent's going to test it. When you actually line up the case files, coastline after coastline, spectacular weaponry turns out to be a poor predictor of the death toll. The animals that fill the files share water with human bodies, warm, shallow, populated water. The tiger shark cruising a remote atoll is a magnificent predator and, statistically, close to irrelevant. A thumbnail-sized jellyfish drifting through a resort swimming area is a public health problem. Danger in the ocean is not a property of the animal. It is a property of the overlap, the places and hours and human habits that put soft skin and venomous tissue in the same cubic yard of sea. An animal becomes dangerous when its habitat is our bathtub, when it's invisible or indistinguishable from the bottom, and when human behavior, wading, net hauling, board paddling, delivers us to it reliably. Weaponry only sets the price of the mistake. Overlap sets how often the mistake gets made. That rule, the overlap rule, is what the Hamilton Island file demonstrates so perfectly. Nothing about that animal wants anything to do with a human being. It has no interest in us, no ability to eat us, barely enough body to fight a ripple. It simply drifts where we swim, at the exact depth where children stand, in the exact months when the water feels best, and it can't be seen. Every deadly encounter in its file is an accident of geometry, and as the files stack up from continent to continent, watch how many times that same geometry repeats, with different animals wearing the role. One more piece of housekeeping, because the numbers in this story deserve to be handled with respect. Counting deaths in the ocean is harder than almost anyone assumes. Rich countries with life-guarded beaches and coronial systems produce good records. Australia can tell you, to a reasonable approximation, how many people its box jellyfish have killed since the 1880s. Large stretches of tropical Asia and Africa cannot, because a fisherman who dies in a village estuary may never appear in any database at all. Researchers who compile attack records say this constantly. The documented numbers are floors. The true numbers sit somewhere above them, and for some regions, far above. So when this story says a crocodile species kills an estimated several hundred people a year, that phrasing's doing real work. It's the difference between what has been written down and what has actually happened. And any honest tour of the world's dangerous coastlines has to live inside that gap. It's worth feeling the scale of what these coastlines actually are before the first file opens. The ocean covers roughly 70% of this planet, and humans interact with almost none of it. We use a ribbon, a strip of warm, sunlit, waist-deep water hugging the continents, a few hundred feet wide, occupied for a few hours a day. A few months a year. Nearly every case in the next 2 hours comes from that ribbon. Almost nothing in this story happens in the open sea because almost no one's ever in the open sea. The deep ocean holds animals with venom and armament beyond anything on this list, and they'll never appear in a coroner's file because they will never meet us. The ribbon is where the entire drama of human and sea creature plays out. And the ribbon's crowded, warm, and murky, and getting more crowded every year. So that's the method. And that's the claim on trial. 7 continents. The actual record, with its gaps admitted. A running comparison between the animals we fear and the animals that fill the files. And underneath it all, one question that the Hamilton Island case planted, and that only the full map can answer. If the deadliest creature on a coastline is usually the one nobody sees coming, then what does the true danger map of the world's oceans look like? And how badly does it disagree with the one we all carry around in our heads? The place to begin is the continent that has turned this entire subject into a science. The continent whose northern beaches post warning signs about an animal, the signs can't show you at actual size, because at actual size it would be a smudge. The continent that built a stinger season into its calendar, nets into its swimming beaches, and vinegar stations into its sand, and that still every summer adds new entries to the file. Australia. Australia's northern coastline is the best documented dangerous water on Earth, which is exactly why it belongs first. Nowhere else has the paper trail, more than a century of medical records, a dedicated research community, surf life-saving associations that count every sting, and coronial files going back to the 1880s. When Australia says an animal is dangerous, there are documents behind the claim. And the animal at the top of the Australian file is the one from Hamilton Island. So this is where that case gets its context. The syndrome that killed the British tourist had been on the books for 50 years before it ever killed anyone, at least as far as the records can show. In the early 1950s, a physician in Cairns named Hugo Flecker kept encountering a strange pattern among swimmers on the beaches of tropical Queensland. People would come out of the sea with a trivial sting, sometimes with no visible mark at all, feel fine for 20 or 30 minutes, and then collapse into an ordeal that filled hospital wards every summer, crushing muscle cramps, waves of vomiting, drenching sweat, a pounding heart, and pain severe enough that some patients needed repeated doses of strong medication just to be kept still. Flecker couldn't find the animal responsible. He could only name the aftermath, and he named it after the Yirginiji people, whose traditional country lies along that stretch of coast. Irukandji syndrome. A disease in effect with an author no one had ever seen. It took another decade and one of the strangest experiments in the history of toxicology to close that gap. In 1964, a Cairns doctor named Jack Barnes decided the only way to prove which animal caused the syndrome was to catch the suspect and test it directly. He spent hours in the water in a weighted diving suit, wading near the sea floor, until he captured a jellyfish about the size of a thumbnail, with 4 fine tentacles and a body so transparent it was barely an interruption in the water. And then, in a step no ethics committee on this planet would approve today, he stung himself with it. He also stung his own young son and a local lifeguard, both volunteers, on the reasoning that a sample of one proves nothing. Within half an hour, all 3 were in severe pain, and shortly after that, all 3 were in the hospital, where all 3 recovered. Barnes published the result in the Medical Journal of Australia. The syndrome had its cause, and the little jellyfish was eventually given his name, Carukia barnesi. The medical literature remembers the experiment with a mixture of admiration and horror, which seems about right. It settled the question, and it's also, by any modern standard, an appalling way to have settled it. What the decades since have established is that Carukia barnesi is only the best-known member of a small family of Irukandji-type jellyfish spread across northern Australian waters, and that the syndrome they trigger is a venom effect with a particularly nasty mechanism. The sting itself injects only a tiny dose, which is why the skin often shows so little. The trouble's what the venom does downstream. It appears to trigger a massive release of the body's own stress hormones, a flood of noradrenaline and its relatives, so that the victim's cardiovascular system is effectively attacked by its own alarm chemistry. Blood pressure can spike to extreme levels. The heart can be damaged. Fluid can accumulate in the lungs. And along with the physical symptoms, patients consistently report something that has become one of the most cited details in marine medicine: an overwhelming psychological sensation of dread, a conviction that they're about to die, so characteristic that emergency physicians treat it as part of the diagnosis. Some patients, in the grip of that feeling, have reportedly begged hospital staff to end their suffering. The syndrome usually is survivable. With modern hospital care, the overwhelming majority of victims recover fully within a day or two. But the 2 deaths of 2002, the Hamilton Island case, and 10 weeks later, a 44-year-old American tourist stung on the outer Great Barrier Reef near Port Douglas, both killed by bleeding in the brain after extreme blood pressure spikes, proved that survivable is a statistical statement, and statistics have tails. Now put the overlap rule against this file, because the fit's uncomfortably clean. Irukandji jellyfish aren't rare. In a typical stinger season, roughly November through May in the tropics, Australian hospitals admit somewhere in the range of 50 to 100 people for Irukandji syndrome, with bad years pushing past that and quiet years falling below it. Those figures come from Queensland Health Reporting and the surf life-saving community, and they wobble with the weather because these animals drift where wind and current deliver them. That's the crucial point. A box jellyfish doesn't patrol. It's planktonic in behavior even though it can swim. And when onshore winds stack warm surface water against the beaches, the season's stinger counts climb. The animal's entire lethal potential depends on arriving, invisibly, in the same waist-deep water where tourists stand. It's the overlap rule in its purest form. A creature with no jaws, no brain to speak of, and no interest in humans, sitting at the top of the file for an entire continent because its habitat and our recreation are the same place. There's one more turn in the Irukandji story, and this one belongs to the future. Researchers along the Queensland coast have documented stings and specimens turning up further south over recent decades. And there's an active scientific discussion about whether warming water is stretching the effective range of these animals toward more heavily populated coastlines. The evidence is suggestive, well short of settled, and honest marine biologists say so. Sting records are noisy, sampling efforts changed, and a bad wind year can mimic a range shift. But the mechanism is plausible, the water's measurably warming, and the stakes are obvious. The most dangerous animals on this coast are the ones delivered by physics to the places where people stand. If the delivery zone moves, the danger map moves with it, and no fence on land has any say in the matter. Set the Irukandji file down for a moment, because Australia's drawer holds a second jellyfish, and by raw lethality, this one stands alone. Chironex fleckeri, the large Australian box jellyfish, carries Flecker's name the way the small one carries Barnes's, and it has a claim no other animal in this entire documentary can match. By documented record, it's probably the most lethal venomous animal in the sea. Its full story, the biology, the venom chemistry, the decades of research, has been told at length in its own dedicated film on this channel, so here it gets the case summary treatment, and the case summary's stark enough. Since records began in 1883, the Australian file attributes at least 64 deaths to this species, with some tallies counting closer to 70 or more depending on how older, less certain cases are scored. A large individual carries enough venom to kill several adults, and the fatal cases can be measured in minutes, with cardiac arrest occurring before the victim reaches sand. Most of the dead have been children, whose smaller bodies take a proportionally larger dose across proportionally more skin. And the encounter geometry is the same story again, in a heavier caliber. A pale, semi-transparent animal, up to about 10 feet of trailing tentacle, hunting small prawns and fish in calm, warm shallows, exactly where a child plays on a January afternoon. The Australian response to these two animals is worth a moment, because it's the most serious infrastructure any nation's built against a sea creature. Stinger seasons are published like weather. Popular beaches in the tropics erect enclosure nets each summer, engineered mesh that excludes the big box jellyfish, though the tiny Irukandji species can drift through some netting, which every warning sign says in plain text. Vinegar stations stand on beaches the way fire extinguishers hang in buildings. An anti-venom for Chironex has existed since 1970, and drilled into generations of Australian school children is the seasonal rule that visitors find hard to believe. For months of the year, on some of the most beautiful beaches on Earth, you simply don't swim outside the nets. The deaths have fallen accordingly, decade over decade. The animals stayed exactly what they had always been. The overlap changed. Since jellyfish first aid's one of the few places in this story where knowing the drill can change an outcome, it belongs in the record, and it's worth stating carefully because the advice is specific to place. The following is the guidance of the Australian and New Zealand Committee on Resuscitation for Jellyfish Stings in Tropical Australian Waters, meaning the Stinger Coast of Queensland, the Northern Territory, and northern Western Australia. If someone's stung there and the animal cannot be confidently identified as harmless, treat it as potentially lethal. Get the person out of the water and keep them still. Call emergency services immediately, which in Australia means 000. If they lose consciousness and stop breathing normally, resuscitation comes before everything else. Douse the stung area thoroughly with ordinary household vinegar for at least 30 seconds, which does nothing for the pain but deactivates undischarged stinging cells still sitting on the skin, so that touching or treating the area doesn't inject more venom. If no vinegar exists anywhere nearby, carefully pick off any visible tentacles, which the guideline notes is safe for the rescuer's fingertips, and rinse the area with seawater. Do not rub the sting, and do not pour fresh water on it, because both can fire the remaining cells. One important branch in that decision tree, Australian guidance doesn't use vinegar on stings from the blue bottle, the small blue sail found on more temperate beaches, and outside tropical Australia the recommended treatments differ by region and species. So the honest summary for a traveler is the one the guideline itself implies. In tropical Australian waters, vinegar and an emergency call. Anywhere else on Earth, learn the local advice before you swim, because jellyfish first aid doesn't travel as well as people assume. The rest of the Australian drawer reads like a museum of specialized venom, and the same physician keeps appearing on the paperwork. In 1935 on Hayman Island, not far at all from the beach where the 2002 Irukandji death would occur 67 years later, a young man picked up a beautiful patterned shell while walking the reef flats. It was a cone snail of the species collectors called the geography cone, and as he handled it, the animal inside drove a hollow, harpoon-shaped tooth into his hand. The record of what followed, documented for the medical literature by Hugo Flecker himself, is one of the most cited envenomation cases of the 20th century. Numbness, spreading from the hand, then paralysis moving through the body over the following hours, and death within the day. Cone snail venom's a cocktail of small proteins that shut down nerve signaling with a precision pharmaceutical chemists openly envy. And there's no anti-venom, none, to this day. Modern reviews of the entire world literature have counted, depending on inclusion criteria, roughly 140 documented cone snail envenomations in recorded history, of which about 36 were fatal, most of those from the geography cone. The channels examined how that harpoon and that venom actually work in a previous film, so the mechanism can rest there. What matters for this file is the shape of the risk. Nearly every serious case in the record involves a human hand closing around the shell. The animal's slow, nocturnal, buried in sand by day, and physically incapable of pursuing anyone. Its entire death toll is, functionally, a tax on picking things up. The blue-ringed octopus belongs to the same category, and its file's shorter than its fame. A golf ball-sized octopus of Australian and Western Pacific shallows, carrying tetrodotoxin, the same paralytic poison found in pufferfish, powerful enough that a single animal holds venom sufficient to paralyze multiple adults, and again with no anti-venom. The channels covered its warning displays and its chemistry before. Its actual documented record, 3 confirmed human deaths in roughly the past 70 years, every one involving an animal being handled or trodden on, and none in the era of modern awareness and rapid resuscitation, because a victim kept breathing, by machine or by mouth until the toxin clears, will generally survive intact. Potency ranking, near the top of the ocean. Case file ranking, a footnote. The gap between those two rankings is this documentary's whole argument, written in miniature. The stonefish completes the trio, and its Australian record contains a number that deserves more attention than it gets, 0. This is routinely billed as the most venomous fish in the world, a fist-sized ambush predator that's functionally indistinguishable from a lump of reef rock, with 13 dorsal spines that act like hypodermic needles when a foot comes down on them. The pains described in the medical literature as immediate and extraordinary, among the worst envenomation pain known. Hundreds of stings occur across the Indo-Pacific every year. And yet, since European record-keeping began, Australia has no confirmed fatality from a stonefish sting. Part of that is an anti-venom available since 1959. Part of it is proximity of care. An Australian who steps on a stonefish is usually within reach of an ambulance. Elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific, on islands where neither of those things is true, deaths are believed to have occurred, and the literature says so, while admitting the documentation's thin. Keep that asymmetry in mind. The same animal, the same venom, a completely different death toll depending on which coastline the foot comes down on. The stonefish will come back in the Asian file, where the equation changes, and then there's the animal in the Australian drawer that actually eats people, because Australia's tropical rivers and coastline hold the saltwater crocodile, the largest living reptile, and unlike everything above, this is a predator, for which a human is legitimate prey. The full treatment belongs to Asia, the heart of its range. The Australian numbers, though, are worth recording precisely because they're so well kept. A study published in the journal PLOS One, drawing on records since 1971, counted 99 saltwater crocodile attacks on people in Australia across those 4 decades. Roughly a quarter of them fatal, which averages out to fewer than 1 death per year, with the rate of attacks rising in recent decades as the once-hunted crocodile population recovered under protection. Fewer than 1 death a year from a 12-foot-plus ambush predator patrolling the same tropics as all those swimmers, and the reasons management. Decades of public education, warning signage, patrolled swimming areas, and the simple, culturally absorbed rule that in the top end, you don't swim in croc country. Australia effectively runs a controlled experiment on the overlap rule and publishes the results. One more Australian entry, included out of respect for the record itself. In September of 2006 at Bat Reef off Port Douglas, the wildlife broadcaster Steve Irwin was killed when a large stingray's barb struck his chest as he swam above it. It was reported worldwide, and it remains the case most people cite when stingrays come up. The honest context is that stingray deaths are vanishingly rare, the barbs purely defensive, and the fatal cases in the world literature almost all involve the improbable geometry of a strike directly to the torso. The ray file's thin. It stays thin. So the Australian verdict? By documented deaths, the most dangerous sea creature of Australia and Oceania is the box jellyfish, with Chironex fleckeri carrying the historical toll, at least 64 dead since the 1880s. And the Irukandji group supplying the modern hospital caseload, and the 2 deaths that open this file. Nothing else on the continent's marine record comes close. The crocodile, for all its capability, averages under a death a year in Australian waters, and the famous venomous celebrities, the cone snail, the blue-ringed octopus, the stonefish, have single-digit or 0 national tolls. A continent ringed by sharks and patrolled by the biggest reptile alive, and the top of its file belongs to drifting tissue, mostly water, with no brain and no intent. That's the pattern to carry north because the next coastline takes the same animals, subtracts the nets, the vinegar stations, the anti-venom stockpiles, and the ambulances, and shows you what the bill looks like then. Asia's file doesn't open with venom. It opens with the only animal in this entire documentary that will deliberately hunt, kill, and eat a human being in salt water, and does so somewhere in its range in most weeks of the year. The saltwater crocodile's territory arcs from the east coast of India through Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines, across the vast island sprawl of Indonesia, through New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, and down to the Australian tropics, where the last chapter left it. Within that arc live hundreds of millions of people whose daily economy, fishing, bathing, laundry, crab collecting, net setting happens at the exact waterline where this animal does its hunting. Everything the overlap rule predicts about that arrangement is in the record, and none of it is comfortable. Start with the animal itself, because the physical facts are legitimately extreme and, for once in this genre, don't need inflation. The saltwater crocodile's the largest living reptile. Adult males commonly exceed 15 feet. Large individuals pass 17. The biggest accurately measured specimen in modern records, a Philippine male named Lolong, captured in Agusan del Sur in September of 2011 after attacks in the area, taped at just over 20 feet and weighed roughly 2,370 pounds, more muscle and armor than a heavy pickup truck can carry. Bite force measurements on large saltwater crocodiles are the highest ever recorded for a living animal, on the order of 3,700 pounds of force in testing of big individuals. And the name's earned. This species crosses open ocean. Satellite tracking studies led by Australian researchers showed salties riding surface currents like commuters, traveling hundreds of miles between river systems, which is why one can appear on an island it was never known to inhabit. An animal that patrols estuaries, tolerates the open sea, reaches a ton in weight, and has ambushed mammals at the water's edge for tens of millions of years, distributed across the most densely populated tropical coastlines on the planet. The arithmetic of that distribution is kept, as well as anyone keeps it, by a database called CrocBite, founded at Charles Darwin University in Australia, which compiles crocodilian attack records worldwide. Across the most recent decade of its records, 2015 through 2024, the database and analyses built on it document several thousand crocodilian attacks worldwide, averaging out to more than 500 reported attacks and roughly 290 reported deaths per year, all species combined. The compilers themselves insist those are floor numbers, because an attack on a fisherman in a remote delta of Borneo or Papua may be known to his village and to no institution on Earth. Estimates that try to account for the unreported cases run to as much as 1,000 human deaths per year from crocodilians globally. Within Asia, the saltwater crocodile owns the file. Indonesia alone reports more saltwater crocodile attacks than any other nation year after year, with the fatality share of attacks in the region running around half, roughly double Australia's rate for the identical species. Same animal, same behavior. The difference is everything around the encounter. No signage, no managed swimming areas, no helicopter retrieval, and above all, no alternative for the millions of people whose livelihood requires standing in that water. An Australian chooses to stay out of croc country. A crab collector in the Sundarbans doesn't have the choice, and the files reflect exactly that. It's worth sitting with one regional example, because aggregate numbers anesthetize. The Sundarbans, the immense mangrove delta straddling India and Bangladesh, supports communities of fishers, honey collectors, and crab gatherers who work its channels every day. The same forest's prime saltwater crocodile habitat and attacks on people working the shallows are a recurring, documented feature of life there, tallied by local authorities and studied in the public health literature, alongside the delta's tigers and its venomous snakes. Occupational exposure is the phrase the papers use, and it's the right one. The people in these files were working in water they knew was dangerous, because the water's where the protein and the income are. When this documentary's closing chapter maps where the ocean actually kills, that phrase, occupational exposure, will mark most of the map. And then there's the story that always comes up, so the record may as well deal with it directly. Ramree Island, off the coast of Myanmar, February 1945. During the Second World War, Japanese soldiers retreating from British forces crossed miles of mangrove swamp, and the version repeated for decades, once even listed by Guinness as the worst animal disaster in history, claims that saltwater crocodiles killed hundreds of them, sometimes stated as nearly 1,000 men, in the course of a single horrific night. Told that way, it would be far and away the deadliest wildlife event ever recorded. And told that way, it almost certainly didn't happen. Herpetologists and historians who have gone back through the war records and interviewed people from the area have found no contemporary documentation of mass crocodile predation. The retreating force suffered terribly from drowning, dehydration, disease, and gunfire, and crocodiles in those swamps may well have killed some men and scavenged many more. But the specific claim of hundreds eaten in a night traces back to thin, second-hand wartime anecdote and grew in the retelling. The honest version is grimmer in an ordinary way. The swamp itself, the water, the exhaustion, did most of the killing, and the crocodiles inherited the legend. Notice the shape of that correction, because it's about to become a theme. Again and again in this subject, the monster story dissolves under examination, and what remains is the water. None of that softens the genuine file. The saltwater crocodile is, by any defensible reading of the documented record, the deadliest predator in Asian seas and estuaries, and the deadliest animal in this entire documentary that actually intends the outcome. Its attacks are hunting behavior, minimally provoked. The victims taken at the margin, usually alone, usually at dawn, dusk, or night, usually within a body length of the bank or the boat. Survivors' accounts and reconstructed cases agree on the signature: an explosive strike from water that gave no warning at all, from an animal that had watched, submerged to the eyes, and had possibly watched on previous days because research on crocodilian behavior supports their ability to learn patterns. And people who bathe or draw water at the same spot at the same hour are, in the coldest biological terms, teaching the river their schedule. Wildlife agencies across the region repeat the same short list, and the Northern Territory government publishes the fullest public version of it in its Be Crocwise program, because it maps directly onto how these attacks actually happen. In crocodile country, assume any river, estuary, creek, or coastal shallow can hold a crocodile, including water where none has ever been seen, because these animals move between systems and along the coast. Stay out of that water entirely, at every hour, since attacks are documented in broad daylight as well as at dawn, dusk, and night, and stay well back from the edge, off steep or undercut banks, and off logs and branches overhanging the surface. Never draw water, bathe, or clean fish at the same spot on a repeated schedule. Where a water point has to be used, use a fenced or caged access where one exists. Keep children and dogs back from the margin, and never turn your back on the water. Camp and moor well back from the waterline, and take fish scraps and food waste away from the water rather than leaving them at the bank. Treat any warning sign as literal, because signs go up where an animal has already been recorded, and if a crocodile is seen near a place people use, report it to the local wildlife authority and keep everyone out of the water rather than trying to move the animal. It reads almost insultingly simple. The files it's distilled from are anything but. Here's where the Australian chapter pays off in the most uncomfortable way possible, because the box jellyfish never respected the Australian border. Species of the same lethal group, including animals of the Chironex genus itself, inhabit coastal waters through the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and beyond, across what biologists call the Coral Triangle, the most biologically rich shallow sea on Earth. Recent surveys by Filipino and international researchers have confirmed lethal box jellyfish species at sites across the Philippine archipelago, and confirmed something else that everyone working on the problem already believed. The stings there follow patterns, seasonal and local, that communities have known about for generations, without any of it being written down in a national database. The numbers, such as they exist, are sobering precisely because of how soft they are. A frequently cited figure, attributed to the United States National Science Foundation in a 2008 report, estimates that somewhere between 20 and 40 people die from box jellyfish stings in the Philippines every year. Some researchers who have worked the region, including the Australian physician Peter Fenner, who spent his career on jellyfish envenomation, have argued the true toll across the Indo-Pacific is considerably higher, because many of the countries in the box jellyfish's range don't require death certificates in rural areas, and a child who dies on a beach in a fishing village may be buried with the cause recorded nowhere at all. Take the conservative end of that estimate, and the comparison still lands like a verdict. At 20 to 40 deaths a year in one country, the Philippines would lose more people to box jellyfish in any 2 or 3 years than Australia's documented in 14 decades. Same genus of animal, same venom. One coastline has stinger nets, vinegar stations, ambulances, anti-venom, and a century of public education. The other has none of those things. More people in the water, and no way even to count its dead. The animal didn't choose any of that. The overlap rule simply collected what the infrastructure gap left on the table. That asymmetry deserves one more turn of the screw, because it applies to the stonefish too, exactly as promised. Australia, with its anti-venom and ambulances, records hundreds of stings and 0 confirmed deaths. Across the islands of the Indo-Pacific, where a reef walker may be hours or days from care, the medical literature holds that stonefish deaths have occurred, while conceding the documentation's fragmentary. The pattern's now 3 for 3, jellyfish, stonefish, and crocodile, and it can be stated as the Asian file's core finding. In this region, what sets the lethality of a sea creature is the distance between the sting and the nearest working hospital. That's an editorial conclusion, but it's one the case files support from every direction. Thailand supplies the version of this story that Western audiences can most easily place themselves inside, because it happened on beaches many of them have stood on. The islands of Koh Samui and Koh Phangan, in the Gulf of Thailand, are among the most visited tropical beaches in the world, and for decades their marketing, reasonably enough, contained no mention of box jellyfish, because almost nobody involved knew they were there. Then the cases arrived in a cluster that forced the issue into the medical literature. In August of 2014, a 5-year-old French boy was fatally stung at a beach on Koh Phangan by a multi-tentacled box jellyfish. The following year, within the same season, a young Thai woman died after a night swim off Koh Phangan, and a 20-year-old German tourist was fatally stung at Lamai Beach on Koh Samui. Thai and international researchers who compiled the region's severe cases in a 2016 study in BMC Research Notes concluded that those 2 islands had the highest concentration of fatal and near-fatal box jellyfish envenomations in Thailand, and that among the fatal cases with records, most had received no vinegar treatment at all, because neither the bystanders nor, in some cases, the first responders had been trained for an animal nobody had told them to expect. The aftermath followed the Australian template at speed: vinegar stations on posts along the affected beaches, warning signage in multiple languages, first response training for hotel and beach staff, and, at some locations, trial stinger nets. The animals had been in that gulf all along. The study's authors and Thai marine scientists treat the apparent rise in cases as some mixture of more people in the water, better recognition of what had previously been recorded as drowning or heart failure, and possibly changing coastal conditions, with the honest waiting between those still unresolved. A death on a dark beach from an invisible animal, attributed to a heart attack because no one examined the sting lines, sits in this literature as one of its standing worries, and it's the single best illustration of why every death count in this chapter is a floor. The next entry in the Asian drawer is the one almost nobody outside the fishing industry ever thinks about, and it may carry one of the larger death tolls in this entire film. The tropical Indo-Pacific is the world capital of sea snakes, dozens of species of true air-breathing serpents that return to the ocean with venom refined for killing fish quickly. venom that ranks among the most potent of any snake on Earth. Swimmers almost never suffer for that fact. Sea snakes in open water are famously reluctant to bite, and divers handle the risk mostly by not handling the animals. The file fills from a different direction entirely: fishing nets. Across South and Southeast Asia, small-scale fishers hauling nets in estuaries and coastal shallows pull in sea snakes by the thousands as unwanted bycatch, and clearing a living, agitated snake from a mesh with bare hands is a task performed at speed, at night, in unlit boats by men who can't afford to discard the catch tangled around it. The classic studies of sea snake envenomation, built on hospital series from Malaysia and refined by surveys in places like Sri Lanka and the Bay of Bengal, found the same profile over and over. The victims are net fishers, the bites are on hands and legs, and one species, the beaked sea snake, accounts for more than half of serious bites and, in the older hospital series, the overwhelming majority of deaths, often cited at around 9 in 10. Its venom attacks both nerve signaling and muscle tissue. Untreated, severe envenomation kills through paralysis and kidney failure over hours. Antivenom exists and works. It exists and works in hospitals. And the men clearing nets at 3 in the morning in the Bay of Bengal are, on average, a very long way from one. Nobody can state the regional death toll with confidence, and this film won't invent one. Surveys of fishing communities in Bangladesh and elsewhere suggest bites are a routine occupational hazard, and deaths a steady, quiet leak, absorbed by villages the way farming communities absorb machinery accidents. No monster reputation, no headlines, no film franchise. Just the single most consistent occupational envenomation pattern in the marine world, running year after year in the statistical dark. So the Asian verdict, and for the first time, the honest answer requires a split decision, stated plainly. Measured by intentional predation, by an animal actually treating humans as food, the most dangerous sea creature of Asia is the saltwater crocodile, with hundreds of documented attacks per year across its range, and a documented death floor in the low hundreds annually, all species of crocodilian combined, of which the salty is the region's overwhelming contributor. Measured by total envenomation deaths, the box jellyfish group very likely takes the continent, on the strength of that estimated 20 to 40 deaths a year in the Philippines alone, plus an uncounted toll across Indonesia, Thailand, and the wider region, with sea snakes an unquantified and probably substantial third column. The truthful summary is that Asia's the only continent where the question has to be answered in the plural, because it's the only continent where multiple sea creatures plausibly kill double-digit numbers of people every single year. And every line of that verdict traces back to the same underlying variable, the one this file's hammered from its first paragraph: the sheer number of human bodies standing in warm, shallow, working water. Asia's animals are matched on other coastlines. Asia's overlap stands alone. Before the file closes, one honest note about the region's sharks, because their absence from this chapter is itself data. Asia's tropical seas hold tiger sharks, bull sharks, and oceanic whitetips, every heavyweight of the shark attack literature. Yet in the continental accounting they barely register, a scattering of incidents per year across the entire region, orders of magnitude below the crocodile file sitting next to them in the same drawer. The animal with the cinematic reputation contributes a rounding error. The animal that actually empties villages of swimmers gets a fraction of the fear. That inversion between reputation and record is about to become the entire subject, because the tour now crosses to a continent whose deadliest marine animal problem makes Asia's crocodile file look modest, and does so with even less of the world watching. Africa's chapter has to begin with a small confession about categories, because the continent's deadliest aquatic animal spends most of its time in fresh water, and an honest documentary says so before using it. The Nile crocodile is, by every serious estimate, the deadliest large animal in African waters, and one of the deadliest wild animals on Earth. Full stop. Most of its attacks happen on rivers and lakes far from any coastline, and those attacks are outside this film's jurisdiction. But the Nile crocodiles never read the definitions. It thrives in brackish water, and it lives, hunts, and kills in the estuaries, mangrove creeks, and river mouths where Africa meets the sea, from the deltas of East Africa down to the estuary systems of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and individuals have been recorded swimming along open coast and reaching islands offshore. Where the tide comes in, this animal's a sea creature, and the coastal portion of its file alone would dominate this chapter, so it takes the African seat, with the asterisk stated out loud. The scale of the overall file is difficult to absorb from a comfortable country. The Crocbite database and the analyses built on it attribute to the Nile crocodile somewhere in the range of 200 to 300 documented human deaths per year. And the researchers who compile those records describe that figure repeatedly and in writing as a serious undercount, rural attack sites, limited reporting infrastructure, and the simple fact that many victims are never recovered all push the real number upward. Assessments that attempt to correct for the reporting gap land in the several hundreds annually, and some estimates for all African crocodile deaths reach toward 1,000 in bad years. Roughly half of Nile crocodile attacks on people are fatal, one of the highest kill ratios of any predator attack data anywhere, and the explanation's mechanical. This is an animal, commonly 12 to 16 feet long, that takes people the way it takes antelope, at the water's edge by the limb or the torso, and drags them under. Compare one more time the continent everyone fears for the wrong reasons. The entire African shark file, all species, all coastlines, in a typical year, holds a small handful of incidents. The crocodile file holds hundreds. The most dangerous animal in African saltwater is the one standing in the shallow, warm, murky place, where the drinking water, the washing, the fishing, and the crossing points are, which is to say, the one standing where the people are. And the victim profile is the harshest version of the pattern this film's been building. In the published studies of crocodile attacks in countries like Tanzania, Mozambique, Zambia, and Namibia, the categories repeat with terrible monotony. People collecting water, people washing clothes, people bathing, fishers setting or retrieving nets, children playing at the margin, everyday domestic life, conducted of necessity at the waterline, in water too clouded to show a shape lying still on the bottom, in the last 3 feet of depth. Crocodile attack researchers emphasize that the animal's ambush is built exactly for that zone. A Nile crocodile can hold its entire body hidden in water shallower than a bathtub, and the final approach is a matter of a second or two. Prevention programs across the region, run by governments and conservation groups, focus on the least glamorous technology imaginable: fenced water access enclosures, essentially crocodile-proof cages extending a few yards into a river or estuary so that filling a bucket stops being a predator encounter. Where they get built and maintained, documented attacks at those sites drop towards zero. It's the Australian lesson, the managed overlap lesson, rebuilt in chain link at the scale of a village. The continent's second seat belongs to a shark, and to the only shark built precisely for this film's thesis. The bull shark, known in southern Africa as the Zambezi shark, is a heavy-set coastal predator with a physiological trick almost no other large shark has. Its kidneys and salt glands let it move freely between salt and fresh water. Bull sharks work Africa's surf zones, harbors, and estuaries, and they run up rivers. The Zambezi name's earned by animals documented far upstream. That trick places them in warm, shallow, sediment-clouded water, at exactly the depth where people swim and wade, which is why shark researchers so often name the bull shark ahead of the great white, as the species they take most seriously on a personal level. In the global attack files, the bull shark sits in the top 3 species for documented unprovoked attacks on humans. And along the KwaZulu-Natal coast, its file was consequential enough that the province built one of the world's most extensive programs of shark nets and drumlines to separate bathers from large sharks, a program that measurably reduced incidents at protected beaches and that conservationists now debate hard because it kills sharks, rays, turtles, and dolphins to protect a statistically tiny human risk. That debate's real and unresolved, and it belongs in the record. The total shark toll on all African swimmers in an average year is in the low single digits, and the machinery built to prevent it kills thousands of large marine animals. Whatever one concludes, it should be concluded with those two numbers side by side. South Africa also holds one of the most storied great white populations on Earth, the seal-hunting whites of the Western Cape, and their African files instructive for what it lacks. Decades of intense human water use around Cape Town and the Garden Route have produced incidents, some fatal, at a rate of a few per year for the entire country in a bad year, against millions of ocean entries. Cape Town's response is the opposite pole from the KwaZulu-Natal nets, the Shark Spotters program, observers on the mountainsides above the beaches with polarized glasses and a flag system, an approach that kills nothing and works because a large shark near a clear water beach can often simply be seen and the water cleared. 2 provinces, 2 philosophies, 1 message consistent with every file so far, which is that the danger's manageable at the level of the encounter, without exterminating the animal. In recent years, orcas hunting white sharks in those waters have scattered the famous aggregations. And the incident numbers moved with the sharks, a natural experiment nobody designed, and everybody should study. One more African entry, less for its numbers than for its honesty value. East Africa's reef flats hold the same stonefish and cone snails as the wider Indo-Pacific. The Red Sea's shallows are full of lionfish and scorpionfish, and Mozambican and Tanzanian waters hold box jellyfish relatives whose stings are documented in the regional medical literature. The toll from all of that venom is real and almost entirely uncounted, for the same reasons as in Asia, and anyone who claims a precise figure for African marine envenomation deaths is decorating a guess. The defensible statement is comparative. Whatever that venom toll is, the crocodile file towers over it, so the African verdict's the least ambiguous of the tour. By documented deaths in salt and brackish water, and by an enormous margin once estuaries are honestly included, the most dangerous sea creature around Africa is the Nile crocodile, with the bull shark taking the deep second seat as the continent's most consequential true marine predator. And Africa sharpens the thesis to its finest point so far because here the overlaps at its most involuntary. Australians are told to stay out of croc water, and can. Across much of coastal Africa, the water is the well, the laundry, the fishery, and the road, and the file grows accordingly in the quietest statistical corner of the world's attention. Hold that thought through the next chapter, because the tour now arrives at the continent with the loudest statistical attention on Earth, the best-counted coastline in history, a place where every single shark bite generates headlines on 3 continents, and where the actual numbers, once you finally see them lined up, are almost embarrassing. In July of 1916, over 12 days on the New Jersey shore, something happened that permanently rewired how an entire civilization feels about the ocean. 4 people were killed, and a 5th badly injured in a string of shark attacks that ran from the resort beaches of Beach Haven and Spring Lake up into Matawan Creek, a tidal creek so narrow and so far from open ocean that when a boy ran down the main street shouting there was a shark in it, the town's adults didn't believe him until men were dying in the water. The 1916 attacks made national front pages, drew a bounty campaign, and embedded a specific image in the American mind: the shark as a malevolent, roving man-eater. 60 years later, that image found its perfect delivery vehicle when a summer movie about a rogue great white terrorizing a beach town became the first true blockbuster in Hollywood history, and the fear went from cultural to industrial. It's a strange fact of media history that the modern world's single most vivid animal terror was substantially built by one press cycle and one film, and the researcher community spent 5 decades trying to talk the public back down. So this chapter is going to do something slightly unfair to the great white shark. It's going to take the most feared marine animal in the Western imagination and read its actual file out loud. The International Shark Attack File, curated at the Florida Museum of Natural History, is the world's standard ledger for this subject, with records reaching back more than a century. Across that entire historical record, the file attributes to the great white shark on the order of 350 documented unprovoked attacks on humans, of which several dozen, on the order of 60, were fatal. Read that again with the time span attached. Roughly 60 documented deaths worldwide in over 100 years of record keeping for the most infamous predator on the planet. In an average recent year, the entire world records something like 60 to 70 unprovoked shark bites of all species combined, with a long-run average of roughly 5 or 6 deaths. In 2024, the file logged 47 unprovoked bites worldwide, the lowest tally in almost 3 decades, 4 of them fatal. 2025 bounced the other way, with fatalities spiking to 12, double the decade average, driven substantially by white shark incidents at Australian surf beaches. And that swing itself is the statistical lesson. When the annual global death toll can double on the strength of half a dozen tragedies, you're looking at one of the rarest causes of human death that anyone bothers to track. Now place the American numbers inside that global picture, because the United States sits at the center of it in the strangest way. Year after year, the United States records more unprovoked shark bites than any other country on Earth, 28 of the world's 47 in 2024. And year after year, almost nobody dies. That year's American toll was 1. The engine of the American numbers is one stretch of Florida coastline. Volusia County, home of Daytona Beach and New Smyrna Beach, logs more shark bites than most entire nations, 8 in 2024 alone, which is why it carries the unofficial title of Shark Bite Capital of the World. And the Volusia File's a beautiful case study in what shark bite actually means outside a movie theater. The species involved are mostly blacktips and their relatives, sharks of 5 or 6 feet built for chasing baitfish through churning, sandy surf. The victims are mostly surfers, whose hands and feet flash and splash at the surface in exactly the visual grammar of a struggling fish, in water so turbid, the sharks striking at silhouettes and glints. The typical result's a single bite and an immediate release, a laceration to a foot or a hand, stitches. A story for life. The scientific reading, supported by decades of these cases, is that the overwhelming majority are mistakes, an investigatory bite by a fish that can't ask questions any other way, corrected the instant the answer comes back wrong. Florida's ledger is long precisely because its sharks are small, its swimmers are millions, and its overlaps total. High contact, low consequence. The exact inverse of the crocodile files across the Atlantic, and the single clearest demonstration in the world that attack counts and danger are different things. The great white's American story runs on a different geometry, and it's one of conservation's most interesting problems. White sharks off California, and more recently off New England, structure their coastal lives around pinnipeds, seals, and sea lions, whose protected populations have rebounded spectacularly since the 1970s. Cape Cod, which had essentially no white shark presence in living memory, has become one of the North Atlantic's premier white shark aggregations inside 2 decades, because gray seals came back by the tens of thousands and their predator followed. The occasional tragedies followed too. A handful of attacks on swimmers and surfers, and Massachusetts towns now live with purple shark flags, spotter planes, detection buoys, and a public that has had to relearn in real time the old Australian habit of reading the water before entering it. California's file tells the same story at larger scale. Steadily more white sharks along a coast used by many millions of surfers and swimmers, incidents that remain rare enough to make national news individually, and deaths that average out to roughly one every year or two for the entire state. Juvenile white sharks, it turns out from drone surveys off Southern California, spend whole summers cruising within a few hundred yards of packed beaches, invisibly and almost entirely without incident, which may be the single most reassuring shark statistic ever collected. The animal's already there, all the time, and almost nothing happens. The great white is a dangerous animal, and the file will say so plainly. It's an animal that can exceed 18 feet and 4,000 pounds, whose ambush strike on a seal is one of the most violent events in the coastal ocean. And when that strike lands on a human, even as a mistake, the outcome can be fatal in minutes. Surfers in cold, seal-rich water off California, South Africa, and southern Australia carry a real, non-zero occupational risk that the statistics fully acknowledge. The point is proportion. The same American public that won't swim at a Cape Cod beach with a flag flying will drive to that beach on a highway that kills more people in an average afternoon than white sharks kill worldwide in an average decade. Fear, it turns out, doesn't read files. The science underneath those numbers deserves its own moment, because the last decades quietly answered the question the 1916 newspapers got so spectacularly wrong. What's actually happening in the shark's head when it bites a person? The rogue shark theory, the idea of an individual animal that acquires a taste for humans and hunts them deliberately, dominated both journalism and policy for half a century, justified bounty hunts on 3 continents, and has been effectively abandoned by shark researchers because the case files never supported it. The overwhelming pattern in the data is a single strike, an immediate release, and a departure, which is very strange behavior for a predator that wanted to eat you and entirely predictable behavior for one that made a sensory mistake and corrected it. Then, in 2021, a team of Australian researchers published a study that made the mistake itself visible. They built a model of the visual system of a juvenile white shark, whose retina resolves far less detail than ours and which sees no color, and ran the view from below through it. Seals swimming at the surface, sea lions, humans swimming, and humans paddling surfboards, all backlit against the bright sky. Through shark eyes, the silhouettes and motion cues of a paddling surfer and a swimming pinniped were, in the researchers' careful phrasing, effectively indistinguishable. The animal that has starred in the Western nightmare for a century turns out to be working from a grainy, gray, upward-looking image, in which a human on a shortboard and the shark's actual prey produce nearly the same signal. And the miracle, given tens of millions of annual ocean entries in white shark habitat, is how rarely the signal gets acted on. Mistaken identity was a courtroom phrase before it was a biology finding. In this file, it's now both, with the model published and the bounty hunts, mostly, in the past. Proportion also has a homily or yardstick, and since this is the continent of the well-kept statistic, the yardstick's available. The National Weather Service attributes to lightning an average of roughly 20 deaths a year in the United States in the recent record. Collisions between vehicles and deer are estimated in the insurance and safety literature to kill on the order of 1 to 200 Americans annually. Domestic dogs kill several dozen. Champagne corks, bee stings, ladders, left-turning traffic, each of these outscores the American shark file, which, remember, averages roughly 1 death per year against many hundreds of millions of beach visits. A citizen of the United States who drives to the coast, walks to the water past a dog, under a summer thunderhead and wades in has already survived, statistically speaking, the dangerous part of the trip. Swimming carelessly in seal country at dusk is still a bad idea. The file is thin, the file is real, and the surfers of Northern California can keep their healthy respect. The argument here is about where a finite budget of fear earns a return, and on this continent, essentially none of that budget belongs to an animal. There's a coda to the American Shark chapter that the 1970s couldn't have imagined. The fear machine ran so hot for so long that it eventually produced its own backlash, and the great whites, now among the most legally protected fish in American and international waters, its killing banned across multiple jurisdictions, its population trends studied with satellite tags and genetic censuses. Meanwhile, the broader ledger between the two species involved has been quantified, and it's the most lopsided statistic in this entire documentary. Humans kill an estimated 100 million sharks per year, a figure published in the journal Marine Policy with a plausible range running from tens of millions to over 200 million for fins, meat, bycatch, and sport. Sharks of all species kill roughly 5 to 6 humans per year worldwide. That's on the order of 10 million to 1 or more, and it means the most dangerous large-animal relationship on the North American coast, measured honestly, runs in the direction no thriller has ever been made about. Before the North American verdict, the file needs its stranger entries, because the continent's sting ledger dwarfs its bite ledger by orders of magnitude, and one corner of it runs on the lunar calendar. In Hawaii, the beaches of Oahu's south shore, including Waikiki, one of the most heavily used swimming beaches in the United States, experience box jellyfish influxes with clockwork regularity, arriving roughly 8 to 10 days after each full moon, when swarms of Alatina alata, a slender box jellyfish whose sting can trigger an Irukandji-like syndrome, drift into the shallows. Lifeguard services post warnings on a schedule, sting counts on bad days run into the hundreds, and ocean-savvy locals simply know which mornings belong to the jellyfish. Hawaiian emergency departments treat the resulting caseload every month. Deaths are extraordinarily rare, with the state's records containing isolated fatal and near-fatal cases over the decades, several involving allergic collapse rather than raw venom dose. As a natural system, it's almost elegant, a predictable tide of venom on a 10-day lag from the moon. As a public health matter, it's that rarest of things in this film, a marine hazard so regular that a calendar defeats most of it. The mainland's sting ledger is less poetic and much larger. Along the Gulf of Mexico and the southern Atlantic coast, Portuguese man-o-war strandings shut down beaches every year when onshore winds herd fleets of them ashore. Florida beach patrols have recorded thousands of treated stings in a single busy season. Stingray injuries concentrate at particular beaches, most famously Seal Beach in California, where the local shuffle-your-feet gospel exists because the sandy shallows are a stingray nursery, and estimates for the United States as a whole run to somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 stingray injuries a year, overwhelmingly ankle wounds from stepped-on rays, overwhelmingly painful, and almost never lethal. Sea nettles fog the Chesapeake Bay every summer. None of this kills more than a vanishing handful of people, ever. And yet it accounts for nearly all of the actual suffering the North American ocean inflicts through its animals. Tens of thousands of envenomations a year against a shark file counting bites in the dozens. Danger has a texture as well as a body count. And for this continent, the texture's a welt on the ankle in July. So the North American verdict, delivered with the file's own dryness. By documented recurring deaths, the most dangerous sea creature around North America is the great white shark, essentially by default, at an average toll of roughly 1 death every year or two across the entire continent's coastlines, because nothing else in the marine fauna maintains even that rate. The box jellyfish relatives of Hawaii and the man-o-war fleets of the Gulf hold the morbidity crown with their tens of thousands of stings, but almost no fatal cases in the modern record. The blacktips of Volusia County hold the raw bite count while almost never doing consequential harm, and the crocodilian seats occupied only by the American crocodile of the Florida Keys and points south. A famously shy species whose United States file contains a bare handful of bites in half a century. A continent of 330 million people with several hundred million annual beach visits, and its deadliest marine animal averages less than one victim a year. The obvious question, the one this whole tour's been narrowing toward, is what actually kills the thousands of Americans the ocean does take every decade. The answer runs through the closing chapter. It has nothing to do with an animal, and it makes every shark headline ever printed look like a category error with a marketing budget. One more piece of North American business first, because the continent hosts the single best natural experiment on a question people have argued about since antiquity. What actually happens when large predatory animals and enormous crowds of humans share water? The answer's on display every summer in Southern California, and it deserves its moment. Research teams flying drone surveys along Los Angeles, Orange, and San Diego County beaches over recent years documented juvenile white sharks, animals of 5 to 9 feet, sharing the surf line with swimmers and surfers on most days of the season at some beaches, often within a wave's length of people who never knew. Across those same surveyed years, incidents at those beaches remained at their historic near zero. The sharks see us constantly. They investigate almost never. Whatever a human being looks like to a young white shark working a warm California summer, the evidence says the overwhelming verdict is irrelevant. It might be the most important single finding in modern shark science for public psychology, and it barely made a ripple against the noise of each individual bite that did happen. The file learns slowly when fear writes the headlines. That California data also sets up the pivot this tour now has to make, because everything about the North American chapter, the tiny death toll, the enormous monitoring apparatus, the spotter planes and detection buoys and drone surveys, describes a continent wealthy enough to measure its ocean and manage its overlap. Follow the same two shark species south across the equator, into waters where a port was built through a shark nursery and nobody flew drones over anything. And the ledger changes so abruptly, so measurably, and with so clear a start date that it reads like a controlled demonstration of this film's entire argument, with a city of 4 million people as the test population. Until 1992, the beaches of Recife, the coastal capital of Pernambuco state in northeastern Brazil, had a shark record about as interesting as any other stretch of tropical Brazilian coast, which is to say close to none. Boa Viagem, the city's signature beach, ran for miles along a reef-sheltered shoreline crowded with swimmers, and generations of them grew up in that water without shark incidents being any part of the city's story. Then, starting in September of 1992, attacks began, and they didn't trickle. They arrived as a series, at a pace and severity that had no precedent anywhere in the South Atlantic. Marine scientists led by the Brazilian researcher Fabio Hazin compiled the outbreak formally in the Bulletin of Marine Science. 47 shark attacks along that short stretch of coast between September 1992 and September 2006, 17 of them fatal. That's a fatality rate around 36%, several times the worldwide average for unprovoked shark attacks, and the counting didn't stop with the study. By the 2020s, the running total since 1992 stood above 60 incidents with roughly 24 deaths along some 12 miles of urban coastline. For 3 decades, one city's carried one of the highest shark attack fatality rates on the planet, on beaches where the water's often warm as a bath and the crowds never left. A change that abrupt, that localized, and that dated is the kind of thing science can actually interrogate. And the interrogation pointed away from the sharks almost immediately. What changed in the years before 1992 was on land. 20 miles south of Boa Viagem, one of the largest port complexes in Latin America, the port of Suape, was built out through exactly the kind of habitat this film keeps returning to. Mangrove-lined estuaries, the nursery and hunting grounds of the local bull shark population. Channels were dredged, mangroves cut, river mouths altered. The estuary system the bull sharks had used was substantially destroyed or blocked, and the working hypothesis of Hazen's team, supported by the geography and timing of the attacks, is that displaced sharks shifted north to the next usable estuary, the mouth of the Jaboatão River, which empties into the sea within easy cruising distance of Recife's most crowded beaches. Add a deepwater channel that runs unusually close to shore along Boa Viagem, past the line of reefs where surfers concentrated. Add tiger sharks, drawn to the harbor traffic that came with the port, including, in the early accounts, waste from slaughterhouse shipments and ship discards in the days before tighter regulation. And the ocean off Recife had been rearranged into an experiment nobody meant to run. What happens when you take a large city's swimming crowd and move a bull shark population's commute directly through it? The bull shark did what its file everywhere else says it does: murky tropical water, river mouth, surf zone, human limbs at the surface. Most of the serious attacks clustered in a defined stretch. Many involved surfers beyond the reef line. And the toll fell so predictably on that group that in 1999, Pernambuco did something almost without precedent. It banned surfing along the affected coast outright by law with fines. The state also created a dedicated shark incident monitoring committee. And over the following years, attack frequency dropped substantially, aided by the ban, by warning infrastructure along the beachfront, and by a program that caught sharks on baited lines offshore and relocated them away from the swimming beaches rather than killing them. The signs still stand on Boa Viagem today, in Portuguese and English, advising bathers of shark risk, and the counting continues at a much slower rate. Recife adapted, the way Australia adapted, the way Cape Town adapted. The water remembers longer. It's worth being precise about what the Recife file proves, because it's the closest thing this entire documentary has to a controlled demonstration. The sharks stayed the sharks. Bull sharks and tiger sharks off Pernambuco in 1995 carried the same teeth and the same instincts as in 1985, when they attacked nobody. The people stayed the people. The same city swam at the same beaches throughout. What changed was one variable: the geometry of overlap redrawn by construction equipment in the space of a few years, and the attack statistics responded like a metered readout. Up when the estuary moved the sharks into the swimming lanes, down when the law moved the surfers out of them. Anyone still tempted to describe shark attacks as malice, as some appetite of the animal for us, has to explain Recife, where the appetite arrived on a schedule set by a port authority. Here the overlap rules literal enough to carry a construction date. And the human texture of the file deserves one respectful sentence because Recife's beaches are democratic in a way statistics flatten. The toll fell heavily on young men from the city's poorer neighborhoods, surfers and swimmers for whom Boa Viagem and its neighboring beaches were the accessible ocean. And the surfing ban, however defensible as policy, took something real from communities that had little else free to take. Environmental risk, moved by industrial development, landing hardest on the people with the fewest alternatives. That pattern has a long history on land, and the Recife file shows it running straight into the sea. The rest of the South American shark ledger only sharpens the contrast. Brazil's thousands of miles of remaining coastline generate scattered incidents at unremarkable global rates. The Caribbean coast of Colombia and Venezuela, the crowded beaches of Uruguay and Argentina, barely register in the international files at all. The Pacific side runs cold, fed by the Humboldt Current sweeping up from the Southern Ocean, and its great whites, present around Chilean and Peruvian waters, have produced only a thin scatter of documented attacks in the historical record. One city, one port, one displaced estuary, subtract Recife, and South America would rank among the safest populated continents on Earth for shark encounters. Included, and the continent's marine danger map is effectively a single glowing point with a date attached, which is precisely why it earns the chapter's headline. But the South American drawer holds a second file, a stranger one, from that cold Pacific side, starring an animal with three hearts, a beak like shears, and a reputation among fishermen so terrifying it earned the name Red Devil. That file needs auditing, because half of what the internet says about it doesn't survive contact with the evidence. The Humboldt squid's a formidable animal by any measure, and nothing in what follows should be mistaken for debunking the creature itself. It grows to around 6 feet, including its arms, with large individuals approaching 100 pounds, and it hunts in coordinated groups that can number in the hundreds, rising each night from depths of over 1,000 feet to feed near the surface, along the eastern Pacific, from Chile and Peru up through Mexico's Sea of Cortez. It carries a parrot-like beak, driven by powerful muscle, arms lined with toothed suckers, and a nervous system quick enough to flash its whole body between white and deep red as it hunts. The display that helped earn it the Mexican fisherman's name, Diablo Rojo, the Red Devil. Divers who have entered feeding aggregations describe being grabbed, raked, stripped of gear, and dragged bodily through the water. The American diver and filmmaker Scott Cassell, who logged hundreds of hours with the species, engineered himself body armor and tethers after early encounters, and his accounts of being slammed and pulled are documented, specific, and credible. An animal that can do that to an armored professional could, in principle, kill a swimmer. The question a file has to ask is narrower: has it? And here the record goes quiet, in a very particular way. The lore's everywhere on that coast and has been for generations. Fishermen who fell overboard at night into feeding schools and were never recovered. Bodies said to have surfaced marked by sucker rings, the standing warning in Sea of Cortez ports that a man in the water during the squid run is a dead man. Television documentaries have chased those stories for decades, and the pattern every serious investigation converges on is the same. The named, dated, verifiable case at the center of the story is never quite there. Accounts trace to a friend of a cousin of a crew. The alleged incidents predate anyone present. The 5 drowned fishermen attributed to squid in one widely repeated tale turn out to rest on no recoverable record of cause. Marine biologists who work with the species point out the confounding problem that makes the lore untestable. The men in these stories fell, at night, into a cold, fast offshore current, often without life jackets, which is fully sufficient to explain a disappearance with no squid involved at all. So the honest audit reads like this: documented aggressive contact with divers, yes, repeatedly. Documented human death caused by Humboldt squid, none that can be verified anywhere in the record this film could find. The Red Devil's a real animal wrapped in an unfalsifiable ghost story. And the ghost story survives because the true explanation, the current, the night, the cold, is the one nobody wants to name at a wake. Notice one more time, where the actual killing power sits in the tail once the monster's subtracted. It sits in the water. There's a small irony worth savoring before the verdict. The humans and the Red Devils meet by the thousands every night on purpose. The jumbo squid fisheries among the largest invertebrate fisheries on Earth, with fleets of small open boats out of Peruvian and Mexican ports hauling squid by handline in the dark, tens of thousands of tons a year, one of the most direct nightly interfaces between people and a large predatory animal anywhere in the ocean. If this species had any meaningful appetite for humans, that fishery would be a casualty list. It's a payroll instead. The most intense human overlap with the most feared animal on the coast, and the file stays empty year after year, which tells you the overlap rule needs both of its halves. Exposure sets the opportunity, and the animal's actual behavior decides whether opportunity becomes a record. Bull sharks convert opportunity. Humboldt squid, on the evidence, do not. So the South American verdict. By documented deaths, the most dangerous sea creatures around South America are the bull and tiger sharks of the Recife coast, an entirely human-assembled hazard with roughly 24 deaths since 1992 concentrated along a few miles of Brazilian beachfront, while the rest of the continent's enormous coastline runs quieter than almost anywhere comparably populated on Earth. The Humboldt squid, the continent's most famous marine menace, closes its file with a formidable body, a documented willingness to rough up divers, and a confirmed human death toll of 0. It's the cleanest demonstration in this tour of how reputations manufactured take a real and startling animal, add unexplained deaths that already had a sufficient explanation, and let the story do the rest. That manufacturing process matters beyond squid, because the next chapter crosses the Atlantic to the continent that invented most of the world's sea monster literature in the first place. A continent whose waters hold, by the record, almost none of the animal danger its mythology promised, and whose single confirmed modern marine envenomation death arrived by wind from the open Atlantic, wearing a sail. The European file opens, like this documentary did, with a specific day at a specific beach. August of 2010, Porto Tramazzo, on the southern coast of Sardinia, Italy. A 69-year-old woman was swimming close to shore when she was stung on the leg. She made it out of the water on her own, in obvious pain, with a vivid red welt rising on her skin. And then, on the sand, within minutes, she collapsed. Resuscitation attempts on the beach failed. The death was reported across the European press and taken up in the scientific literature on Mediterranean jellyfish, where it's treated as the first recorded death from a marine sting of its kind in modern European waters. With an important clinical nuance, the coverage sometimes flattened. The evidence points to anaphylactic shock, a catastrophic allergic response to the venom, rather than a directly lethal dose. The distinction matters medically, and it does nothing to soften the fact pattern. A swimmer at a family beach on the most domesticated sea on Earth, killed in minutes by an animal that had no business being there, because the animal responsible was an Atlantic drifter that had sailed in through the Strait of Gibraltar. It was a Portuguese man-o-war, and 2010 was the summer the Mediterranean learned its name. The man-o-war deserves a careful description because it's one of the most misunderstood organisms in the sea, and its strangeness is central to why it kills so rarely and frightens so effectively. Swimmers call it a jellyfish. Biologists file it as a siphonophore, a floating colony in which specialized bodies, one forming the gas-filled sail, others forming the feeding tissue, the reproductive tissue, and the tentacles, function together as a single apparent creature. The sail, a translucent blue-violet float shaped like an old warship's rigging, rides the surface wind. The animal cannot swim at all, cannot steer, cannot pursue, cannot retreat. Below it trail the tentacles, routinely 10 to 30 feet long, and in large specimens reported to something like 100, armed with batteries of stinging cells that fire on contact and keep firing, after the tentacle's been torn from the colony, after the colony's dead, after fragments have washed ashore and dried in the sun. Everything it does to a human is done passively, by wind and contact geometry. That's precisely what makes its file interesting. Here's an animal with no behavior toward us whatsoever, whose entire lethality budget is set by weather. When the wind blows fleets of them onto swimming coasts, sting counts explode into the hundreds and thousands, as beach services from Florida to Spain can document. When the wind holds offshore, the same animals graze the open Atlantic and touch no one. The Irukandji's invisible in the water. The man-o-war's worse in a way. Perfectly visible, garishly so, and delivered in bulk on exactly the days the surf looks most inviting. Its European record fits that meteorology. The species has always brushed Europe's Atlantic face, stranding on the beaches of Portugal, Spain, France, Ireland, and Britain in wind-driven pulses that force lifeguard flags and, in heavy years, outright beach closures from the Bay of Biscay to County Cork. What changed in the 2010s, and has kept changing since, is the Mediterranean. Repeated incursion years, tracked in the scientific literature since that 2010 swarm season, with sightings and strandings now recurrent enough that Spanish and French Mediterranean beaches post man-o'-war warnings most summers. A sentence that would have sounded absurd to a beachgoer in 1990. Researchers connect the pattern to Atlantic inflow, wind fields, and warming surface water, with the usual honest caveats about short records and patchy observation effort. Serious systemic reactions remain rare. The Sardinian death remains, in the modern European record, singular. And the routine harvest is pain, a whip line of burning welts, hours of misery, occasional emergency admissions for the unlucky, the allergic, and the small. Europe's deadliest documented marine animal, by the record, is a colony of drifting polyps with no brain, no jaws, and no locomotion that arrives by weather forecast. As continental champions go, it's almost an anticlimax, and that's the point of the European chapter. On the best monitored, most swum, coldest watered, and most predator-emptied coastline in the world, an anticlimax is what the top of the file looks like. Beneath the man-o'-war, the rest of the European drawers thin, and its contents are instructive in their smallness. The continent's most commonly encountered venomous animal is one most Europeans have never heard of until the moment they meet it sole first. The weaver fish, a few inches of sand-colored ambush predator, spends its days buried on the seabed of exactly the beaches where northern Europe swims, from the Mediterranean up through the French and British Atlantic coasts to the North Sea and beyond, with only its venomous dorsal spines at sand level. Step on one, and the result's a sting whose pain is notorious in every lifeguard hut from Cornwall to Denmark, radiating up the leg for hours. Thousands of these stings happen every summer across European beaches. British and Irish beach services log them as their single most common venomous injury. The venom's heat-sensitive, which is why the standard treatment used by lifeguard and health services and published by the British National Health Service and is immersing the foot in water as hot as the person can comfortably stand without scalding, for roughly half an hour or until the pain eases, topping the water up as it cools, and having someone whose hand is not numb check the temperature first, because a stung foot cannot judge heat, and burns are a real risk. Anyone stung should still get to those services, both for the treatment and because embedded spine fragments and infection are the usual complications, and pain that keeps climbing, swelling that spreads beyond the foot, or any faintness or difficulty breathing means emergency care instead of a bucket. Deaths are essentially absent from the modern record. The literature preserves a single, often cited historical fatality from early in the 20th century, and even that case carries uncertainty. Europe's most frequent venomous encounter, and its file across a century of crowded beaches, amounts to pain, swearing, and a hot bucket. The Mediterranean's own signature stinger scales the same lesson up by orders of magnitude. The mauve stinger, Pelagia noctiluca, a small purple jellyfish that glows faintly at night, blooms in warm years into swarms that arrive at Spanish, French, and Italian beaches in their millions. In heavy bloom summers, regional health services have treated tens of thousands of stings in a single season. Beaches from the Costa Brava to Sicily have closed, and marine scientists tracking the blooms link their apparent increase to warming water and the systematic removal, by fishing, of the predators and competitors that once checked them. a same story, different latitude echo of every human rearranged file this tour's opened. The stings hurt sharply and occasionally send the allergic or the extensively stung to the hospital. The confirmed death toll from all of it, across decades and tens of millions of exposures, rounds to that single Sardinian case and a scattering of disputed reports. If you want a single statistic that captures the European Ocean, it's that ratio. Stings in the hundreds of thousands, deaths approximately 1. The continent's headline Predator file, meanwhile, has spent the 2020s being rewritten in the strangest way imaginable, and honesty requires including it precisely because it involves no human casualties at all. Beginning around 2020, a small subpopulation of orcas along the Iberian Atlantic coast, fewer than 50 animals, critically endangered, began interacting with sailboats, approaching from astern, striking and biting the rudder, sometimes spinning the vessel, occasionally disabling steering entirely. The behavior spread through the group. Hundreds of interactions have been logged from the Strait of Gibraltar to Galicia, and several yachts, their hulls or steering fatally compromised, have sunk after crews were taken off. Researchers studying the population debate whether it's play, a socially transmitted fad among juveniles, or something related to a bad experience with a vessel. Nobody credibly claims it's predation. The crucial line in the file, across all of it, no human's been so much as injured. The largest predator ever to enter this documentary, an animal that kills great white sharks for their livers, has conducted a multi-year campaign of contact with human vessels while maintaining, in the wild, the species' extraordinary record of 0 documented human fatalities, ever, anywhere. Boats have been lost. Every sailor's come home. As a pure test of the difference between capability and danger, the Iberian orcas may be the most eloquent animals in this entire film. For completeness, the Mediterranean does hold great white sharks, and always has. The historical record scattered across Italian, Greek, Maltese, and Croatian waters includes documented attacks across the 20th century, and the species evidently bred in the basin historically. Today, the Mediterranean white sharks among the most endangered large shark populations in the world, cited a handful of times a year at most, and the modern attack files dwindled toward 0 along with it. Europe solved its shark problem the way industrial fishing solves everything comprehensively and by accident, and a coastline of hundreds of millions of annual swimmers now produces fewer shark incidents per decade than Volusia County produces per summer. So, the European verdict? By documented deaths, the most dangerous sea creature around Europe is the Portuguese man-o'-war, on the strength of 1 confirmed modern fatality and a sting ledger that spikes with every westerly gale, with the weaver fish and the mauve stinger supplying the continent's vast, almost perfectly non-lethal volume of suffering. Stated plainly, Europe is the continent where the animal danger of the ocean's been reduced nearly to 0 by cold water, by emptied predator populations, and by an infrastructure of lifeguards and hospitals denser than anywhere else on Earth. And yet Europeans keep drowning by the thousand every single year in seas containing functionally nothing that wants to hurt them. The lifeboat institutions of Britain and Ireland, which keep some of the world's most careful records of coastal death, publish the causes annually, and animals appear nowhere on the list. Cold shock, rip currents, offshore winds, alcohol, unwatched children, kayaks, and swimmers caught by conditions. The European file, read to the end, is this documentary's thesis stripped of its last distraction. Remove every dangerous animal from a coastline entirely, and the coastline keeps killing at almost exactly the same rate because the animals were never the load-bearing part of the danger. That finding needs 1 more continent to become undeniable, and the tour saves it for last deliberately. The one place on Earth where the ocean holds a genuine, documented, man-killing predator and almost no people. and where the water itself is so lethal that the predator barely alters the arithmetic. South then, as far as south goes, on the 22nd of July, 2003, in the middle of the Antarctic winter, a 28-year-old marine biologist named Kirsty Brown was snorkeling near Rothera Research Station on the Antarctic Peninsula, conducting survey work for the British Antarctic Survey with a colleague nearby and observers on shore. Under the safety protocols the survey had refined over decades of routine scientific diving, a leopard seal that no one had seen surfaced, seized her, and pulled her under. Colleagues reached her within minutes, recovered her from the water, and began resuscitation immediately, continuing as the boat ran for the station's medical facility. She could not be revived. The subsequent investigation, published and absorbed into Polar Operating Procedure Worldwide, Heindig Medikalagor, recorded that she had been held underwater for on the order of 6 minutes and taken to depths estimated at more than 200 feet, and that in 30 years of British Antarctic survey diving and snorkeling operations, nothing like it had ever happened. It remains to this day the only documented human death caused by a leopard seal, and because it happened inside a scientific institution under written protocols with trained witnesses, it's one of the most completely documented marine animal fatalities in history. Antarctica's entire predator file on humans is, in effect, one meticulously recorded case. The animal in that file deserves to be described accurately, because the popular imagination files it as a cuddly seal, the horror version files it as a serpent, and the real animal sits well outside both. The leopard seal is Antarctica's apex pinniped, females the larger sex, reaching over 10 feet and around 1,000 pounds, built long and reptile-lithe, with a gape and dentition unlike any other seal, massive canines for seizing penguins and young seals at the front, trident-shaped molars for sieving krill at the back, a two-mode jaw for an animal that's simultaneously a filter feeder and the Southern Ocean's most versatile warm-blooded predator short of the orca. It hunts alone along the ice edge, patrolling where penguins must enter and exit the water. The history of human encounters before and after 2003 is a thin ledger of near misses and warnings. A member of Shackleton's expedition chased across the ice in 1915 by a leopard seal that had stalked him from below, saved when another man shot the animal. A British explorer bitten through the leg at an ice edge in the 1980s and saved by his companions. Snorkelers and photographers menaced, mouthed, or charged in incidents polar programs now log carefully. And alongside those, famously, the counterledger, the National Geographic photographer Paul Nicklin spent days in the water with a huge female that, apparently interpreting him as an incompetent predator, repeatedly brought him penguins, live ones, then dead ones, in what he described as attempts to feed him. Curiosity, predation testing, misdirected maternal behavior. Nobody can fully say. The honest summary is that this is a large, intelligent, solitary predator whose interest in humans is real, rare, and unpredictable, and that the 2003 case proved the worst outcome possible without establishing that it's anything but extraordinarily unlikely. Polar programs responded the way serious institutions do. Leopard seal sighting protocols, water evacuation rules, revised snorkeling procedures. The seal kept its ocean. The humans adjusted their overlap. By now the shape of that sentence should be familiar, but Antarctica earns its place in this documentary as the honest edge case, the continent that forces the file to admit what has been accumulating in its margins since Hamilton Island. Because here's the Antarctic arithmetic in full. Documented deaths from the continent's only man-killing marine predator in a century of polar exploration and science. 1. And the sea that predator swims in kills, or would kill, essentially any unprotected human who enters it within the hour, every time. No predator required. Antarctic seawater sits near 28 to 29 degrees Fahrenheit, below the freezing point of fresh water kept liquid by its salt. A person immersed in water that cold without protection experiences what cold water physiologists, following the Canadian researcher Gordon Giesbrecht, describe in a famous shorthand, roughly 1 minute of cold shock, involuntary gasping and hyperventilation that can drown a swimmer in the first moments if the airway goes under. Roughly 10 minutes, and in water this cold, plausibly fewer, of functional swimming before hands, arms, and legs fail as the body shuts down its periphery, and something like an hour, give or take the individual, before hypothermia takes consciousness. Those numbers describe protected, prepared, life-jacketed immersion in a textbook. In the Southern Ocean, far from rescue, they compress toward a simple statement that every polar training course delivers on day one: the water is the emergency. The most dangerous thing in Antarctic waters is not an animal. It is the water itself. That statement earns its bluntness because Antarctica's where the two rankings this documentary opened with, weaponry versus record, finally collapse into each other and disappear. There's no continent where the resident predator is more capable relative to the number of humans available, and no continent where the predator matters less to the actual survival arithmetic. Every Antarctic field manual, every ship drill, every immersion suit stowed by every bunk exists because of temperature, and the leopard seal appears in those manuals as a paragraph inside a chapter that's otherwise entirely about the sea itself. One recorded death by animal, a long, sober list of deaths by water, by cold, by ice, across the whole history of the continent's exploration. The southernmost file in the drawer closes on the quietest and most complete version of the pattern, and it hands the tour its final chapter. Because if the coldest, emptiest ocean on Earth says the water outranks the animal, the question left standing is whether that's also true everywhere else, on the warm, crowded coastlines where the rest of us actually swim. The closing file answers with numbers, and the numbers are lopsided beyond anything the monster stories prepared you for. Lay every file from this tour side by side, and two maps of the world emerge, and they disagree with each other almost everywhere. The first is the map of fear, the one most of us carry without ever having audited it. It's dominated by teeth. Its capital's a shark fin off a beach in a movie from 1975. Its provinces are giant squid, killer whales, and things with tentacles rising under small boats. On the map of fear, the danger scales with the size and armament of the animal, and the open ocean, deep and dark, is the most dangerous place of all. The second map's the one the case files actually draw, and it looks nothing like that. Its darkest regions are warm, shallow, and crowded. The stinger coasts of the Coral Triangle and northern Australia, the estuaries of Indonesia and the Sundarbans, the river mouths and washing places of tropical Africa, 12 miles of beachfront in northeastern Brazil. Its danger scales with human bodies per square yard of warm water, with turbidity, with poverty, with distance from a hospital. And on the map of the record, the open ocean, the deep water of the nightmare, is among the safest places a human can possibly be, because nothing in this documentary can harm a person it never meets. Run the ledger one final time, continent by continent, in the driest numbers the files support. Australia and Oceania, the box jellyfish, at least 64 documented deaths since 1883, plus 2 Irukandji deaths in 2002, on the best defended coastline in the world. Asia, the saltwater crocodile, hundreds of documented attacks a year across its range. Amanitotrawh, sharing the continental title with box jellyfish, estimated by the National Science Foundation to kill 20 to 40 people annually in the Philippines alone, with sea snakes collecting an uncounted toll from the hands of net fishers. Africa, the Nile crocodile, 200 to 300 documented deaths a year, half of attacks fatal. The true figure acknowledged by everyone who compiles it to be higher, with the bull shark a distant second. North America, the great white shark, roughly a death every year or two, on a continent whose sting ledger runs to tens of thousands of casualties a year, and whose bite capital, Volusia County, has never had those bites amount to much more than stitches. South America, the bull and tiger sharks of Recife, roughly 24 deaths since 1992, a hazard with a construction date. Europe, the Portuguese man-o-war, one confirmed modern death, on a continent of hundreds of millions of swimmers. Antarctica, the leopard seal, one death, in a sea that needs no help. Total the animal columns for the entire planet. Be generous with every estimate. Count the crocodile's full inland range, every uncounted jellyfish death in every unrecorded village, every sea snake in every net, and the world's marine and estuarine animals plausibly kill somewhere between several hundred and, at the outer edge of estimation, perhaps a couple of thousand people in a year. Hold that number. The World Health Organization, in its first global status report on the subject, estimated that drowning killed approximately 300,000 people in 2021. 300,000 in 1 year, a toll that has actually fallen substantially over the past 2 decades and still amounts to a large passenger aircraft's worth of people roughly every day, most of them children and young adults. The overwhelming majority in low and middle-income countries, many of them in the same rivers, deltas, and coastal shallows. This documentary's been visiting for 2 hours for other reasons. Not all of those drownings are in the ocean, and honesty requires saying so. Lakes, rivers, ponds, and wells claim a great share. But confine the view to the coasts of the wealthy, well-counted world, where animal fear runs hottest, and the pattern holds with brutal clarity. In the United States, rip currents alone, those narrow lanes of seaward flowing water that form quietly on ordinary surf beaches, are estimated by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to kill around 100 people in an average year, and they account for the substantial majority of the tens of thousands of rescues American beach lifeguards perform annually. Sharks, in an average year, kill about 1 American. The ratio between those two numbers is roughly 100 to 1, in favor of a hazard most beachgoers can't name, describe, or recognize, against a hazard with its own week of television programming. Cold water immersion kills boaters and swimmers across the northern latitudes every year in numbers that dwarf every European animal file combined. The animal that fills the nightmares fills almost no graves. The water fills them quietly, everywhere, every day of every year. This is the practical inversion the whole tour's been building toward, and it can be said without a gram of mysticism. Every continent's most dangerous sea creature summed together worldwide kills fewer people in a year than drowning kills in a single average day. If danger's measured by the record, then the most dangerous thing the ocean ever shows a human being is a current, a temperature, an offshore wind, a moment of inattention at the waterline with a small child. The animals are a rounding error wearing teeth. Every danger named so far will almost certainly never touch you. The one that actually might deserves the guidance in full, and that guidance comes from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the United States Life-Saving Association, complete, with its branches intact. A rip current is a narrow channel of water flowing away from the beach, out through the surf, often where waves are strangely absent, a gap of darker, calmer-looking water between lines of breaking waves, sometimes carrying a plume of churned sand or debris seaward, is the classic signature, and the calm looks exactly what lures swimmers into it. A rip current carries you seaward along the surface, away from the beach, and the people it kills are almost all people who exhausted themselves fighting it. So, if you're caught in one, stay calm, because the current itself leaves you at the surface, and panic and exhaustion are the mechanism that drowns people. Do not swim against it back toward the beach, no matter how strongly instinct demands it. Even strong swimmers lose that race. Float or tread water, let it carry you, and swim out of the current sideways, along the shoreline, parallel to the beach, because rip currents are narrow, and once free of the flow, you can return to sand at an angle away from the rip. If you can't escape it, keep floating, face the shore, wave an arm, and yell for help. The current weakens beyond the surf, and flotation plus attention is a survivable condition. And if you're the one on the beach watching someone else caught, get a lifeguard. And if there's none, call 911 and throw or push anything that floats toward the person, a bodyboard, a cooler, a ball. But do not swim out after them without flotation, because the record on that is grim and consistent. And many of the rip current dead were would-be rescuers. Swim at lifeguarded beaches when you can. Check the surf zone forecast before you go. And if the flags are up, believe them. That's the entire protocol. And knowing it cold is worth more than every shark fact ever memorized. Add the northern branch of the same practical file. Cold water, below about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and severely below 50, sudden immersion triggers the cold shock response described in the Antarctic chapter. A first gasp and a minute of uncontrollable breathing, during which an unprotected airway can take on water, followed within minutes by failing limbs. The safety services of every cold water nation converge on the same short instructions, and the Royal National Lifeboat Institution publishes the most widely taught version of them as Float to Live. If you fall in, resist the urge to thrash and swim immediately. Lean back in the water with your ears submerged and your head tilted up. Spread your arms and legs. Move them gently, only as much as it takes to stay afloat. And hold that position for the first minute or two until the gasping stops and your breathing settles. Only then make for the nearest exit point or flotation, using the working minutes your limbs still have. And if there's no exit within reach, keep floating and signal for help rather than swimming to exhaustion. Once out, get dry, get insulated, and get warm gradually, and treat anything beyond a brief immersion as a case for medical services. A person pulled from cold water should be kept horizontal, handled gently, and shielded from the wind while help's on the way, because the body can still deteriorate after the rescue. On boats in cold water, the life jacket does the surviving. The United States Coast Guard's drowning statistics report year after year that the great majority of boating drowning victims weren't wearing one, and that single strap remains the highest value piece of safety equipment on any body of water on Earth. None of this is dramatic. Neither is the actuarial table it comes from. There's one more entry in the honest ledger, and it belongs to the animals side of the accounts. Fear has a price, and for 50 years the animals in this film have been paying it. The study in marine policy that estimated 100 million sharks killed by humans annually was describing an industry, running quietly in the background of every summer during which a handful of shark bites made global headlines. Analyses published in the journal Nature have estimated that the worldwide abundance of oceanic sharks and rays declined by roughly 70% in the half-century after 1970. Culling programs built explicitly on public fear, nets and drumlines of the kind this film visited in South Africa and that Australia still operates, kill sharks, rays, turtles, and dolphins annually to reduce a risk already measured in single digits per year per continent. The crocodiles of northern Australia were hunted nearly out of existence before protection in 1971 rebuilt the population, and with it, an attack file that management keeps smaller than a bad month of road statistics. Every animal at the top of every continental file in this documentary, the box jellyfish accepted, is either in decline, recovering under protection, or actively persecuted somewhere in its range because of a reputation that collapses the moment its own record is laid down beside it. The record says the fear was misallocated. The invoice for that misallocation was made out to the animals, which leaves the audit of the original question, the one in the title, answered continent by continent and then, honestly, overruled by the totals. The most dangerous sea creature around each continent is real, named and documented. A jellyfish, a crocodile again, a shark with a construction date, a wind-blown colony, a seal. The most dangerous thing around every continent is the same on all 7. Moving water, cold water, deep water, water taken casually. Learn the animal files for fascination, because they're fascinating. Learn the water rules for survival, because that's where the survival is. The numbers couldn't point more consistently in one direction if they had been arranged on purpose. For the traveler who now wants the files translated into behavior, the honest version's short, and every line of it comes from the agencies and researchers this film's been citing all along. In tropical Australia, swim inside the stinger nets in season, keep vinegar in reach, and treat local signage as the distillation of a century of coronial files. Because it is. Across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, ask locally about jellyfish seasons before you swim, because the knowledge exists in every coastal community even where no database does, and wearing a full coverage rash guard or wetsuit in tropical water is quiet, unglamorous sting insurance that Australian lifesavers have recommended for decades. In crocodile country on 2 continents, the rule has no exceptions worth your life. Assume any water can hold one. Stay well back from the edge, and stay out of it entirely, at every hour of the day, because these attacks are documented in full sunlight as readily as at dusk. On the shark coasts, the Florida Museum's own published risk reduction list is almost suspiciously mundane. Swim in groups, stay near shore, avoid dawn and dusk, skip the water where people are fishing or bait fish are schooling and birds are diving, leave the shiny jewelry on land, and accept that splashing at the surface is, to a fish reading silhouettes, an advertisement. And everywhere on Earth, without exception, the life-guarded beach, the checked forecast, the sober swim, and the watched child do more statistical work than every other precaution combined. All of it comes down to respecting the specific, boring mechanisms by which the ocean actually harms people, which this entire film's been one long argument for doing. It's also worth recording, in the interest of full honesty, what this file can't yet close. The undercounting problem is the central limitation of the entire subject, and if the villages of the Coral Triangle, the Bay of Bengal, and the African lakeshores ever get the reporting infrastructure the wealthy coastlines take for granted, several numbers in this film will be revised upward, and the revision will land almost entirely on the jellyfish, the crocodiles, and the sea snakes, the animals of poor, warm, working water. The warming ocean's moving ranges as this narration is being read. Irukandji records creeping south along Queensland, man-o'-war summers, becoming ordinary in the Mediterranean, box jellyfish surveys turning up lethal species at new sites in the Philippines, white sharks following recovering seals into waters that had forgotten them. The Recife hypothesis, persuasive as the timing is, remains a reconstruction that can no longer be tested against the estuary it lost. The Iberian orcas haven't explained themselves, and somewhere in the gap between 20 and 40 deaths a year in one archipelago, between 200 and 1,000 crocodile deaths a year on 2 continents, between the counted and the countable, sits the real total, which no one alive knows. The files stay open. That's what makes them files. So the answer to the title, as of today, stands as delivered. 7 continents, 7 names, a box jellyfish, a saltwater crocodile, a Nile crocodile, a great white shark, the displaced bull sharks of one Brazilian city, a Portuguese man-o'-war, a leopard seal, And behind all 7, on every coastline, the same unlisted entry outscoring them combined, roughly 300,000 to perhaps 2,000, water to animals, in an average year, by the most careful counts humanity keeps. If you've stayed in the water this long, thank you, and I mean that, because a 2-hour argument built out of coroner's files and current charts asks more of an audience than a highlight reel of teeth ever would. And you took the long route. Here's what would actually help this channel keep making documentaries like this one. Go to the comments and tell us which file rearranged something for you. Maybe it was the 20 to 40 deaths a year that never make the news while a single shark bite circles the world. Maybe it was a squid acquitted for lack of evidence, or an orca that sinks yachts and has never scratched a sailor. Or tell us about your water, the beach, lake, or coastline you grew up on, what the local warnings feared, and what, knowing what you know now, they probably should have feared instead. Those comments really do steer what we investigate next. And some of our best films started as a viewer's story about a place we had never looked at. If the film held you, the like button's the simplest way to tell us so. And subscribing means the next deep file we open, and there are drawers in this archive we've barely touched, shows up for you, without luck being involved. The ocean keeps very honest records. Stay curious about them, swim where the lifeguards are, and we'll see you in the next one.